Tonight, we delve into the shadowed corridors of power, where the Vatican's most feared leader once moved unseen. A figure whose authority never needed a throne, whose influence stretched through maps, manuscripts, and whispers in hidden chapels. His reach was silent, precise, and eternal, controlling the flow of knowledge, the rhythm of history, and even the timing of revelation itself. Those who uncovered his traces found staircases bricked over, codices written in invisible ink, and a network of secrets spanning centuries. And those who sought to reveal his methods were met with silence or disappeared into archives that never permitted escape. Tonight, we lift the veil on the strategies, the symbols, and the instruments of a power so carefully preserved that it has shaped history without ever being seen. Before we step further into the shadows, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It began on a night that felt older than time itself, the kind of night where the air seems to hum with a secret no one dares to speak. The streets of Rome were nearly empty, bathed in the amber glow of street lamps that flickered like dying candles. Somewhere between the Vatican walls and the Tiber River, a courier rode through the silence, carrying something that should not have existed. In his hands was a sealed codex, its wax pressed with a papal emblem no historian could recognize. The seal was unlike any in the Vatican's archives. It bore the mark of a cross within a circle, surrounded by 12 small stars, the same design rumoured to belong to a vanished order, said to serve the church from behind the veil of history. When he arrived at my door, his eyes held the look of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. He said only one thing before leaving me in the candlelight. This was never meant to be found. Then he disappeared into the mist like a ghost returning to its grave. I stared at the codex for a long time before daring to touch it. The parchment was thick, aged, and faintly warm, as though it had been held by many hands across many centuries. There was no title, only the seal, and a faint inscription written in Latin that translated to "For the Keeper of the Hidden Light." I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt drawn to it, as if some part of me already knew that opening it would change everything. When the wax cracked under my knife, the sound echoed through the room like a whispered confession. The first page was blank, except for a single sentence written in ink that shimmered faintly under the candle. To read this is to awaken what was put to sleep. I didn't know what it meant, but as I turned the next page, something strange happened. The words began to shift, as if the ink were alive. They rearranged themselves into a timeline, one that didn't match any history book I had ever seen. Events overlapped, years repeated, popes appeared who never existed. And in the centre of it all was a name written over and over again, the Shadow Pontiff. My hands trembled as I read further. The pages spoke of a leader more feared than loved, one who ruled not with armies but with silence, a man who never appeared in paintings, never issued decrees in his own name, yet whose decisions shaped every corner of the church. His power was absolute because no one believed he existed. According to the Codex, he was the architect behind centuries of erased years, missing records, and rewritten truths. A ghost pope hidden in plain sight. The candle flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall, tall, robed, and still. I closed the book and felt a chill crawl up my spine. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's struck midnight, their echoes carrying across the sleeping city. Somewhere deep within the Vatican, I imagined another bell answering in secret, tolling for a history that was never meant to be remembered. At first, I thought the name was a metaphor, a poetic invention from some forgotten monk who wanted to sound mysterious. But the more I read, the clearer it became that the Shadow Pontiff was not fiction. He was a real person, a figure who once held power greater than any pope in recorded history, yet his existence had been completely erased. The Codex described him not as a ruler who sought glory, but as one who thrived in secrecy, shaping events through others while never appearing in official documents. It was as if he had been surgically removed from time, leaving behind only whispers that clung to the edges of history like smoke after a fire. The text spoke of letters that no longer exist, papal decrees signed by hands that were not his but carried his will. Some monks referred to him only as Il Silente, the silent one, the voice behind the throne, who determined what knowledge the world was ready to receive and what truths were too dangerous to survive. I began searching for any mention of this name outside the Codex, desperate to prove or disprove what I was reading. Yet in every official Vatican record, every list of popes from St. Peter to the modern age, there was nothing. No trace, no footnote, no shadow. It was as though he had never lived. But history has a strange way of remembering what it tries to forget. In the margins of a 13th century manuscript held at the Bibliotheca Apostolica, a faint notation caught my eye. It read, "He who sits in silence speaks through all." There was no attribution, but the handwriting matched the codex. Then, in a collection of letters between Benedictine scribes from the early 12th century, one phrase reappeared, almost hidden between lines of Latin scripture. "The man with no name guides the pen of God." It was always cryptic, never direct, but it pointed to something deliberate. Someone had been written out. Someone powerful enough to erase themselves from history. What unsettled me most was the reason given in the Codex for his disappearance. It said the Shadow Pontiff commanded the Church to remove every trace of his name from future records as an act of devotion. He believed that true power could only exist unseen, that influence without recognition was divine. It was said he created an entire system to ensure the Church could operate in two realms, one visible and one invisible, one for faith and one for control. The visible Church was the Vatican that the world knew, with popes, bishops, and rituals. The invisible one was the machinery of secrecy that decided what humanity was allowed to believe. And at its centre, long before the modern era, stood the Shadow Pontiff. The more I read, the more the line between myth and reality blurred. It wasn't the absence of proof that frightened me. It was the possibility that the absence itself was proof. The Codex didn't want to be read. It wanted to be remembered. Power does not always reveal itself through loud commands or open wars. Sometimes it hides in silence, in the things that are never said and the records that quietly disappear. The Codex called this method the Silence Protocol, a doctrine designed to control history, not by rewriting it, but by knowing exactly when to let it fade. It explained that the greatest tool of influence is not censorship, but omission. You do not need to burn a book if you can ensure no one remembers it existed. The Vatican, according to these writings, mastered this art over centuries. Their strategy was simple but terrifying. When knowledge threatened doctrine, they did not destroy it in the open. They archived it under new names, buried it in vaults, or reclassified it as heresy so that future generations would dismiss it without question. In this way, truth was not lost. It was put to sleep. The protocol outlined 3 principles. The first was called the pause. It meant that every major discovery, event, or revelation that could shake the world's faith had to undergo a period of silence before it could be acknowledged. Some truths were delayed for years, others for centuries. The second principle was substitution. If silence could not be maintained, something else had to fill the gap. A legend, a miracle, or a simplified version of events. The third was absorption, the most subtle of all. When forbidden knowledge became too widespread to hide, the Church would adopt it, sanctify it, and claim it had always been theirs. By absorbing truth into faith, the line between revelation and manipulation vanished. The Codex gave examples, written in cryptic Latin, hinting at forgotten councils and unnamed popes who used the protocol to steer history. It spoke of astronomers silenced before their findings could reach the public, of manuscripts sealed before printing, of scholars who vanished after discovering timelines that did not align. It even suggested that the Church's greatest strength was its ability to let people believe they were free to question, while ensuring the answers never led anywhere new. The more I read, the more I realized silence was not absence, it was design. Every missing record, every erased name, every blank in the history books was a calculated decision. A pause in the narrative, waiting to be filled only when it served the right purpose. That night, I tried to imagine the men who created such a system. Not cruel men, perhaps, but careful ones. They believed they were protecting humanity from truths too heavy to bear. But who decides which truths are dangerous? The Codex never answered that. It simply ended the chapter with one final line written in red ink. To command silence is to speak forever. I closed the page and listened to the quiet around me. For the first time, I wondered how much of history had vanished, not through violence or chaos, but through the simple obedience of those who chose not to speak. The Vatican has many doors that are never opened, and many corridors that lead to places no map dares to show. I met Father Matteo inside the archives, a thin man with tired eyes and the calm voice of someone who had seen too much, but was forbidden to speak. When I mentioned the Shadow Pontiff, his expression changed. He didn't ask how I knew the name. He only said one thing: "Follow me, and do not look back." We passed through a narrow passage hidden behind a wall of false shelves. The air grew cold as we descended, the light dimming to a single flicker from the oil lamp he carried. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the ground opens into a maze of stone chambers, older than the city itself. Father Matteo stopped before a section of wall blackened by time. He placed his hand against the stone, whispered a prayer in Latin, and pressed a small cross carved into the surface. A faint click echoed. The wall shifted just enough to reveal the edge of a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. "The black staircase," he said softly. "It was sealed after one procession, only one." I asked what that procession was. He told me the story in a whisper, as if the walls themselves were listening. Long ago, when Rome was still trembling under invasions, and the Church was struggling to define its power, a secret ceremony took place beneath the basilica. A leader, unnamed in every official document, was crowned not before the people but in the shadows below. They called him the Pontiff of Silence. The last to see him said the ceremony was unlike any other, performed without music or candles. The monks carried black banners instead of gold, and no prayers were spoken aloud. When the ritual ended, the procession descended these stairs and vanished into the depths. The staircase was then sealed by order of the Church and never reopened. Those who tried to document it were reassigned or disappeared. Father Matteo said, "The stairs led to a chamber known in whispers as the Chamber of the Veil, a place where forbidden decrees were signed and hidden." The Vatican denies its existence, but the codex I had read mentioned it as the birthplace of the Silence Protocol. I leaned closer to the opening. The air that rose from below was heavy and cold, carrying the scent of earth and something older, like parchment and smoke. For a moment I thought I heard faint echoes, voices murmuring from deep below, repeating words I could not understand. Father Matteo crossed himself and stepped back. "Some doors," he said, "were meant to remain closed, even to God's servants." He placed his hand on the stone and slowly pushed it shut. The click echoed again, sealing whatever secrets slept beneath us. As we climbed back toward the light, I couldn't stop thinking about the leader who had descended those steps centuries ago, followed by men who vanished without a trace. The Vatican above was bright, alive, filled with tourists and bells, but somewhere below, in eternal silence, history was still walking down that black staircase. The door to the scriptorium was not supposed to open. It had no keyhole, no handle, and no record of its existence. Yet Father Matteo found a way, tracing an ancient cross with the tip of his ring finger until a quiet latch released. The air that escaped was stale and dry, like the breath of centuries trapped behind stone. Inside, rows of wooden desks stood untouched, their surfaces covered in layers of dust so thick it looked like snowfall. In the center of the room sat a single ledger, bound in dark leather, its corners reinforced with tarnished brass. It was larger than any book I had seen, and the words carved into its cover read in Latin, Chronicon Vacui, the Chronicle of Emptiness. When I opened it, my hands trembled. Each page was filled with precise handwriting, a monk's careful script recording the passage of years. But the numbers were wrong. Years appeared and vanished mid-sequence. Some repeated, others skipped entirely. There were entries for events that never appeared in any historical record, and then, abruptly, entire decades missing. Between the years 508 to 812, entire pages were marked only with a single word, written in red ink, nullus. It meant nothing. Father Matteo explained that this ledger was said to contain the original ecclesiastical calendar, the master record from which all later histories were copied. Yet here, in this hidden volume, the rhythm of time itself was broken. The codex I had read before mentioned something called the phantom years, periods that may have been added or removed to manipulate divine prophecy or political continuity. What startled me most was how neatly the missing years aligned with eras of unrest, heresies, and wars that history claims never occurred. There were even notes referring to rulers who were never born and councils that were never convened. If these entries were true, then the timeline we live by might not be real. I noticed a strange pattern in the margins. Tiny symbols beside each erased year, some resembling stars, others simple dots and lines, as though marking celestial events. Father Matteo leaned closer and whispered that monks once used astronomy to verify dates. If a total eclipse failed to match a calendar year, they adjusted the record to preserve divine order. Over time, those adjustments became deletions. Truth was reshaped, not by force, but by mathematics and faith. The Vatican, it seemed, had found a way to bend time to protect its own perfection. As I turned the final page, my heart pounded. The last entry was dated 813, but the handwriting was different, hurried, fearful. It read, "Time has been corrected. The world will never know." Then a final line, almost erased, "He watches from the silence." I closed the ledger and stared into the candlelight. The thought chilled me more than the air in that room. What if the past we study is a shadow, and the real history lies in the blank spaces between the years? If time itself can be edited, then truth is not lost. It is rewritten, and we are living in its correction. The dictamen was unlike anything else in the codex. It was written on thinner parchment, the ink darker, almost reflective, as if the words were meant to be seen only in candlelight. The first line read, "He who commands time commands memory. He who commands memory commands truth." It was a doctrine, a manual of power attributed to the Shadow Pontiff himself. Unlike papal decrees filled with scripture and faith, the dictamen read like the blueprint of a system. It was divided into 3 parts: the frame, the lens, and the light. Each one described not a belief, but a method of control. The frame referred to time, the very structure of history. The document claimed that human memory is not built on facts, but on sequence. If you alter the order of events, you alter understanding. By shaping calendars, declaring holy years, and adjusting what counted as the beginning and end of eras, the Church could dictate how people perceived the flow of civilization. The frame was not time itself. It was how time was remembered. The lens was education. According to the dictamen, the human mind could be moulded the same way a craftsman polishes glass. Teach the same version of events to children for 3 generations, and it becomes the only reality. The Church's schools, the monasteries, and later the universities all served as the lens. They filtered what was too bright, softened what was too dark, and presented only what would not blind the faithful. Even truth, if not taught, ceases to exist. Then came the light, revelation. The dictamen warned that pure light was dangerous. Too much knowledge at once could burn faith to ash. Therefore, light had to be controlled, dimmed, or redirected. New ideas were to be introduced gradually, disguised as rediscoveries, never as revolutions. In this way, humanity would always believe it was awakening, while still being guided by the unseen hand. The closing section described how the frame, lens, and light worked together. It said, "By time we bind, by knowledge we shape, by faith we rule." The words were chilling because they didn't sound evil, they sounded logical. They sounded like something written by someone who truly believed he was saving the world from chaos. Father Matteo told me that rumors of the dictamen had existed for centuries, whispered among scholars who claimed that every major reform in history, from the calendar to the printing of the Bible, followed its structure. I asked if the Vatican still used it. He looked at me for a long time before answering. "Power never changes its tools," he said quietly. I stared again at the parchment, the ink glinting in the light, and realized the most dangerous truths are not the ones hidden away, but the ones disguised as wisdom. If the dictamen was real, then every moment of history had been carefully framed, every truth filtered, and every revelation timed. And in that silence between the words, the shadow pontiff was still watching. He met me in a courtyard behind the old Jesuit college, just as the bells of St. Peter's began to toll. His robe was simple, the black fabric worn thin at the edges, yet there was something about him that commanded silence. He introduced himself only as Father Lucien, and refused to shake my hand. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had confessed too much and been forgiven too little. Without a word, he led me through an archway into a small library, its windows shuttered and candles burning low. The air smelled of wax and dust, the scent of knowledge deliberately left to age. He placed a single folded letter on the table between us. "You have seen the dictamen," he said quietly. I nodded. "Then you already know why you should not be here." His voice was calm but sharp, like glass beneath water. He told me there were men within the Vatican who did not serve the Pope we see, but a greater authority, one that had existed since the earliest centuries of the Church. They were not rebels or heretics, but guardians of a legacy too dangerous to name. They called themselves the Custodes Umbrae, the Keepers of the Shadow. Each generation chose one among them to hold the true power of the Church, not publicly, but from behind every decision, every proclamation, every miracle that shaped belief. This figure was never crowned, never painted, never buried with honours. He was known only by the title Shadow Pontiff. Father Lucien's tone was steady, but I could see his hands trembling. He said that the Shadow Pontiff ruled through silence, not through authority. He could command a pope without speaking a word. He could erase a century by closing a book. "You think leadership requires a throne," he said, "but a throne is only a distraction. True power sits in the unseen." He told me that the Jesuit order had been created in part to protect this hidden lineage, serving as its eyes and ears while the visible church managed faith. The Jesuits were known for education, for missions, for reason. But beneath those purposes was another vow, one that bound them not to a man, but to an idea born in darkness. He leaned closer and whispered, "There is always one who knows, always one who watches." I asked if the Shadow Pontiff still existed. His lips tightened. "Existence is not the right word," he said. "He does not live as you or I do. He is inherited, not remembered." The candle beside him flickered, and for an instant his shadow on the wall seemed to stretch impossibly tall, its head crowned in light. When he rose to leave, he placed the letter in my hand. "You will not find his name," he said, "but you will find his pattern. Every age leaves his fingerprint somewhere." Then he walked into the corridor, his steps fading into the distance. I opened the letter, expecting answers, but there was only a single line written in red ink. The throne is not the seat of power, the silence is. It was Father Lucian who led me to the archive beneath the Jesuit college, a room that did not appear on any blueprint. The air was thick with dust and salt, the scent of parchment that had once travelled the world. He told me the Vatican's map collection was far greater than anyone could imagine, that for every chart displayed in museums, there were 10 more locked away beneath the city, untouched for centuries. Among them were maps so detailed and precise they seemed impossible for their time. Yet what caught my eye was not their beauty, but a strange symbol pressed into the corner of several of them, a mark of 12 stars encircling a cross within a circle, the same seal I had seen on the codex. Beneath the symbol was a single phrase written in Latin that translated to conceal by accuracy. I asked Father Lucian what it meant. He said it was the motto of a forgotten order of cartographers who served directly under the Shadow Pontiff. Their mission was to redraw the world, not to hide it, but to disguise truth beneath perfection. Every coastline, mountain range, and river was carefully adjusted by degrees so that the maps would appear flawless, while ensuring no one could use them to find what the Church wished to keep hidden. The more accurate the map appeared, the more effective the deception. It was genius and terrifying at the same time. One of the maps showed a coastline at the bottom of the world, long before explorers ever reached those regions. It matched the contours of Antarctica without ice. Another depicted a corridor running beneath the Mediterranean, connecting ancient temples to early Christian sites, a path that no modern archaeologist has ever found. The details were stunning, precise to the point of obsession, yet modern records deny these features ever existed. Father Lucian whispered that the cartographers who created these maps believed they were serving God by safeguarding divine secrets. But one of them, a man named Girolamo Vespi, began to doubt. He believed the maps were being used not to protect truth, but to bury it. Before he vanished, he added something hidden within his final chart, an invisible message revealed only by heat. When a candle was held close, faint words appeared near the equator. They read, "The world you see is the mask of the one beneath." No one knows what happened to Vespi, but the Vatican declared him mad, and his name was erased from official history. Still, his maps survived, sealed in this room, forgotten until now. As I traced the coastlines with my finger, I realized what the Shadow Pontiff had done. He turned knowledge into camouflage. The truth was not removed from the world. It was buried beneath too much precision, hidden in the beauty of its own perfection. I looked again at the seal and understood the sin of the cartographers. They were never told to lie. They were told to draw the truth so carefully that no one would ever find it. The first time I saw the star table, I thought it was a work of art. Rows of hand-drawn constellations stretched across parchment, the colour of amber, each line and angle marked with mathematical precision. It was signed only with the initials L, C, and dated in Roman numerals corresponding to the year 728. But what made the table extraordinary was not its beauty. It was what it revealed. The positions of the stars did not match the official calendars of that era. According to modern astronomy, several of the constellations recorded in the table could only have appeared in those alignments more than 2 centuries later. The implication was impossible. Either the astronomer had somehow seen the future, or the timeline we accepted was wrong. The Vatican records listed no scholar by those initials, yet Father Lucian believed he knew who the man was. Brother Lorenzo Solani, a Benedictine astronomer who lived in a monastery near Florence during the 8th century, famous for charting the heavens in defiance of papal restrictions. Solani was said to have built a device that could track celestial movements with unmatched accuracy. The Codex mentioned him once, only briefly, describing his work as dangerous to the chronology of divine order. He had predicted an eclipse on the 21st of June in the year 728, visible over Rome, yet no such eclipse exists in the Church's official records. But when modern astronomers traced the sky backward, they found it. The eclipse happened exactly as Solani wrote it, proving his calculations were correct and that the Church's timeline had been altered. Father Lucian told me that after publishing his findings, Solani was summoned to Rome for questioning. He was accused of tampering with sacred chronology, a charge that meant death. According to hidden correspondence found centuries later, Solani was never executed. He simply disappeared. The Vatican declared his works lost in a fire, though no fire was ever recorded. In truth, they were locked away. The star table I held was likely the last piece of his research, preserved in secret, because it contradicted the calendar the Church had spent centuries perfecting. As I examined the parchment, I noticed a faint mark beneath the last row of numbers, a tiny cross within a circle surrounded by 12 dots, the same seal of the Shadow Pontiff. The message was clear. Even the heavens were rewritten to fit the order of silence. I stepped outside that night and looked up at the sky, trying to imagine what Solani had seen. The same stars, the same darkness, and the same endless rhythm that cannot be edited. No matter how carefully the Vatican adjusted time, the sky remembered. The moon still followed its path, the sun still marked the truth, and the stars still told the story that no one could erase. The man who mapped the heavens was chained by those who feared what the heavens would reveal, yet the stars have never once obeyed the silence of men. The Index of Forbidden Books was meant to protect the faithful from corruption. That is what the Church always said. It was a list of titles banned from reading or publication, first issued in the year 1559 and updated for centuries after. But what most people never knew was that there was another list, one that was never written down in any official archive. The Index within the Index. I learned about it from a letter found inside an old Jesuit journal, signed only with the initials M.F. The letter spoke of authors whose names were not to be destroyed, but quietly remembered in secret, so that their absence would appear natural, not forced. These were thinkers, scientists, poets, and even priests whose work challenged the very structure of belief. The Vatican did not burn their words, it buried them under silence. Father Lucian told me that the true power of censorship is not destruction but direction. To erase something completely would invite curiosity, but to let it fade slowly gives the illusion of natural forgetting. The index within the index was used to guide that forgetting. Certain books were banned publicly while others, far more dangerous, were never acknowledged at all. The names of their authors were recorded only once, in a private ledger kept by the Custodes Umbrae, the secret order that served the Shadow Pontiff. Each time, an author was marked for removal. A ceremony was held in the Vatican's lower archives. A monk would write the author's name in red ink on parchment, read a prayer of silence, and then lock the record inside an iron chest. It was said that every erased name was whispered 3 times before sealing so that heaven would remember what earth was forced to forget. The chest was known as the Librarium Absconditus, the hidden library. It was not filled with books, but with names, each one representing a voice removed from the world. I once asked Father Lucian why the Church would keep such a record if the goal was to erase them. He replied, "Because even silence requires witnesses." The thought chilled me. Somewhere beneath the Vatican, there could be thousands of names lying in the dark, people who changed the world in ways we will never know. The letter described one final ritual. When an author's name was sealed, a single copy of their work was placed in the vault beside it, not to be read, but to ensure that the truth could never fully die. It was preservation through imprisonment. The more I learned, the clearer it became that censorship in the Vatican was never simple. It was not about suppressing lies, but about shaping reality itself. To control what people read was to control what they could imagine. The index within the index was not a list of forbidden books. It was a map of forgotten minds, and it proved that sometimes the most powerful act of control is not to erase memory, but to curate it. The story of the choir began like a legend whispered among scholars. They were called the Cantores Obscuri, the singers of the hidden, an order of monks who lived in isolation within the hills outside Perugia during the 12th century. They were known for their haunting chants that no one else could replicate, melodies said to bring listeners to tears without understanding why. The Vatican praised their devotion, but few knew that their music carried more than worship. It carried a code. I learned about them from a cracked parchment hidden inside a hymnal in the Jesuit archives. It described how the choir's plain chants contained secret intervals, tiny variations in pitch, that, when transcribed mathematically, formed coordinates. The monks had hidden messages inside their songs, weaving knowledge into the rhythm of prayer. Father Lucien explained that the order had been formed under the direct guidance of the Shadow Pontiff. Their purpose was to protect what could not be written. When a text or artifact was too dangerous to keep on paper, it was translated into sound. Each note became a letter, each pattern a word. The songs were performed during nightly mass, disguising their messages as sacred devotion. The monks believed that by hiding truth within worship, they were preserving it in the safest place possible, under the ear of God. For centuries, no one noticed. Then, in the year 1486, a scholar named Matteo de Ferri decoded one of their hymns and discovered it pointed to a chapel near the Umbrian Valley, beneath which lay a sealed vault. He wrote to the Vatican for permission to investigate. Days later, he was found drowned in the river, his notes confiscated, and the choir dissolved under orders from Rome. The chapel still stands, silent and empty. The locals call it the Chapel of the Unheard Mass. When Father Lucien and I visited it, the air inside felt heavy, as if the walls still remembered the sound of voices long gone. On the altar was a single symbol, carved so faintly it was almost invisible. The cross within a circle, surrounded by 12 dots. The same seal again. I traced it with my hand, and felt a faint vibration, a hum that seemed to echo through the stone. Father Lucien whispered that some believed the vault below contained manuscripts written before the first Bible was compiled, texts the Church deemed too dangerous for the world. We found no door, no visible entrance, but when we played a recording of one of the surviving chants, the vibration grew stronger. The tones seemed to resonate with the walls themselves. It was as if the song remembered its origin. The choir may have been silenced, but their harmony endured, carrying a message only the patient could hear. As we left, I could not shake the feeling that the music had followed us, soft and distant, like a memory refusing to die. The choir never sang again, but their silence was a song that still echoed beneath the stones of faith. The festival of St. Francis filled the streets of Perugia with music and lanterns, laughter echoing through the alleys, while bells rang from every church tower. It was the perfect distraction. No one would notice a stranger slipping away toward the old chapel in the valley, the one locals avoided after sunset. Father Lucien had warned me not to go alone, but curiosity had become stronger than caution. I waited until midnight, when the last fireworks faded and the air grew still. The chapel stood shrouded in moonlight, its wooden doors swollen with age. Inside, the silence felt alive. Dust hung in the air like mist, and the faint smell of wax and parchment lingered. The chants of the Cantores Obscuri seemed to echo from the walls, though no one was there. I lit a small lantern and moved toward the altar. The faint vibration I had felt before was stronger now, pulsing beneath the floor. Behind the altar, a carved stone panel showed faint seams that looked out of place. I pressed against it, and the panel shifted slightly. A hidden door opened to a narrow stairway, descending into darkness. I hesitated only a moment before going down. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed like a metronome marking forgotten time. At the bottom was a small chamber lined with wooden shelves. Scrolls and documents lay scattered, their bindings frayed but intact. I had found what the monks had been protecting. The vault was real. I began scanning the documents, expecting old hymns or forgotten prayers, but what I found instead were slips of parchment covered in Latin text, stamped with the same seal I had seen again and again. The cross within the circle, surrounded by 12 dots, the Shadow Pontiff's sigillum. Each slip bore a name and a description written in careful script, but what caught my breath were the dates. None of them were older than 50 years. These were not ancient records, they were modern, and beside each name was the phrase documentum vivum, living document. The meaning struck me slowly. These were not artifacts from the past. They were ongoing files, people still alive, individuals under observation or perhaps preservation. I found one slip marked with a date from the year 1972, another from 2014. The last one was dated only 3 years ago. Each one signed by a hand identified only by the title Custos Umbrae, Keeper of the Shadow. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. The vault was not a grave of lost knowledge. It was a living archive, updated even now. Someone, somewhere within the Vatican, was still following the orders of the Shadow Pontiff. I gathered one slip to take with me, but before I could move, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, approaching from above. I extinguished the lantern, clutching the parchment in darkness. The footsteps stopped at the threshold, and a voice spoke softly, calm and certain. You were never meant to see the inventory. The door closed, and I was left in absolute blackness, holding a secret that was still alive. Florence at sunrise looked innocent enough, its domes glowing gold beneath the morning light. But the closer I looked, the more I saw a city built on secrets carved into stone. Father Lucian once said that the Renaissance was not a rebirth, but a negotiation. A quiet duel between the church and those who remembered what it had hidden. I began to understand what he meant when I stood before the facade of the Palazzo dei Libri, a building most tourists never noticed. Its marble looked ordinary from afar, yet between its columns lay a strange pattern of numbers and geometric shapes, carefully arranged by the hands of master masons in the 15th century. At first it seemed decorative, a flourish of symmetry. Then I realized it was a code. The sequence of carved numerals followed the pattern of prime numbers, each paired with a symbol used by early Freemasons. When aligned with the city's grid, they formed a path stretching across Florence, connecting certain buildings like points on a star map. I followed the trail through narrow alleys to the edge of the Arno River, where it ended at the Church of Santa Croce. There, above the main door, a stone marked with a compass and square bore an inscription too faint for most eyes to notice. It read in Latin, "He who measures the light measures time." That phrase appeared again in one of the slips I had taken from the chapel vault, the one bearing the Shadow Pontiff's sigillum. The connection could not be coincidence. The Freemasons had not been enemies of the Vatican, at least not at first. They were collaborators and rivals in the same game, architects of symbols who understood that the world could be shaped by geometry as easily as by scripture. Their true quarrel was not with the church, but with the invisible figure guiding it. The Shadow Pontiff and the early Masonic orders fought a war of ideas, one hidden in stone and number, each trying to control the balance between secrecy and revelation. As I studied the carvings, I saw that the numeric path spelled out a message. When translated from Latin numerals into letters, it read, "He walks still." The phrase sent a chill through me. Was it a warning, or proof that the influence of the Shadow Pontiff had survived into the Renaissance and perhaps beyond? The Masons, in their silent defiance, had left a trail that mocked the Church's illusion of control. Their cathedrals and palaces were not only works of beauty, but acts of coded resistance, geometry as rebellion. Father Lucian later told me that the Vatican tolerated the Masons because it feared them. They were the only ones who could match the Church's secret language with one of their own, Every arch, every column, every pattern carved into marble was a message in a hidden conversation that still continues today. Standing there, I felt the strange weight of history pressing through the stones. The facade was no longer a wall, it was a mirror, reflecting the truth that for centuries the Vatican had never been alone in its shadowed game. The document was buried in a folder marked with a single word, Inquisitio. Inside were minutes from a tribunal held in Rome during the year 1573, but there was something immediately strange about it. There was no mention of a defendant, no witness list, and no confession. The court had gathered not to judge a man, but a thought. The proceedings described a theory called the doctrine of eternal motion, a belief that the universe had no beginning and no end, that creation was a cycle rather than a single divine act. It was a concept that undermined the Church's most sacred teaching, that everything began with Genesis. The tribunal's records showed that the idea itself was placed on trial. The judges debated not evidence, but consequences. They weighed what might happen if humanity accepted that the cosmos existed beyond divine control. For days they argued about the danger of allowing such thoughts to circulate. One cardinal wrote, "If the mind believes in an eternal universe, the soul will cease to need salvation." On the final day, the verdict was delivered. The theory was found guilty of heresy. The sentence was recorded as oblivion. No one was executed. No books were burned. Yet the idea was condemned to death in silence. It was forbidden to be discussed, written, or even imagined. The tribunal concluded with an unusual act. The presiding priest wrote the sentence on parchment, sealed it with red wax bearing the cross within a circle and 12 dots, and ordered it buried in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The mark of the shadow pontiff. Father Lucien told me this trial was not unique. Across the centuries, similar proceedings took place. The Church had learned that killing thinkers made martyrs, but killing their ideas left no trace. A trial with no defendant could erase an entire school of thought without drawing attention. The doctrine of eternal motion was not lost, however. It resurfaced in fragments through the writings of Giordano Bruno, and later through the works of scientists like Newton and Einstein, who unknowingly revived the same forbidden question. How can time begin if it never truly ends? Each rediscovery was treated as a revelation, yet the roots always led back to that silent trial in 1573. Reading the document, I imagined the empty courtroom, the flickering candles, the echo of Latin prayers over an invisible prisoner. The sound of chains meant for words, not men. It struck me then how many ideas had suffered the same fate, condemned in whispers and erased without fire or blood. This was how the Vatican mastered the art of control. They did not have to destroy truth. They only had to delay it, bury it long enough for the world to forget it had ever been known. The tribunal's closing line haunted me most. It read, "What cannot be silenced in man may yet be silenced in time." Those words, signed beneath the seal of the Shadow Pontiff, proved that even silence could be made into law. He lived in a forgotten wing of the Vatican, among gears, pendulums, and the scent of machine oil. They called him Canon Bellardi, though few even remembered he existed. His workshop was a cathedral of ticking sounds, hundreds of clocks, and celestial models spinning in slow, graceful rhythm. In the centre stood a massive orrery, a model of the heavens crafted from brass and silver. Each planet moved in perfect harmony, driven by a mechanism older than the Gregorian calendar itself. When I asked how long it had been running, Bellardi smiled faintly. "Since before the world agreed on what year it was," he said. He was thin and stooped, his eyes bright behind thick lenses. Every movement he made was precise, as if his hands were used to handling time itself. He told me the orrery did not follow the modern calendar, nor the Julian before it. It was calibrated to something older, a truer rhythm of the cosmos, known only to a few. The heavens do not lie, he whispered. But men learned how to make time do so. He turned a small brass key on the base, and the planets began to move. As they rotated, tiny inscriptions glimmered beneath the lamplight, phrases etched in Latin along the orbit lines. I leaned closer to read one, and my heart froze. It bore the seal I had seen before, the cross within the circle surrounded by 12 dots, the shadow pontiff's sigillum. Bilardi saw my reaction and nodded. Yes, he ordered it built. Not as a toy, but as a regulator. I asked what he meant, and he explained that the shadow pontiff had commissioned the orrery in the year 1284 as part of something called the Chronos Doctrine. It was a secret system used to determine when suppressed knowledge would be released to the world. Truth, Bilardi said, is dangerous if given at the wrong time. The leader believed even light must obey a schedule. Every revolution of the orrery marked not just planetary motion, but the measured release of information. When certain alignments occurred, the Church would permit the unveiling of discoveries that had been hidden for centuries, presenting them as new revelations. You think the Renaissance came by accident? He asked. It came when this machine said it should. He guided my hand to a small dial beneath the model. It was engraved with both ancient and modern years, but they did not align. According to his orrery, we were not living in the year 2025, but closer to 1730. Nearly 3 centuries missing, stolen by calendar reform and silence. I felt dizzy, as if the floor itself had shifted beneath time. Bilardi said the device still functioned, though few understood it now. The Shadow Pontiff's successors kept it running, adjusting the gears whenever humanity strayed too close to forbidden knowledge. He didn't just control time, Bilardi murmured. He decided when the world would be allowed to wake up. As I watched the orrery spin, I realized the Vatican did not just measure the heavens. It measured history itself, and the clock had never stopped. The clue appeared in a ledger that should not have survived. It was a Jesuit command record from the year 1541, written in thick black ink and signed by early generals of the order. The paper was brittle, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. I had been tracing the orrery's inscriptions when Father Lucian led me to it, hidden in a drawer beneath the Vatican's map room. On the final page, a name had been written and then violently crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase it with a blade instead of ink. Only half remained. The letters M. Ink, followed by a smear of red wax. Beside it, a faint note read, General of the Unseen Ranks. Father Lucian's voice trembled when he spoke. You have found him, the Black General. I asked if the name referred to Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, but Lucian shook his head. No. Ignatius was the light the world was meant to see. This was the shadow he served. He explained that during the early years of the Society of Jesus, while Loyola's mission spread through universities and courts, another figure worked behind the scenes. This man held no official title and appeared in no portrait. He was said to oversee the most secret division of the order, one that reported not to Rome but directly to the Shadow Pontiff. The Vatican referred to him only in whispers as the Black General. It was he who established the protocols of silent authority, teaching his followers how to wield power through obedience rather than visibility. He commanded no armies, Lucian said, yet his reach was greater than any king's. He could move nations with a letter. According to the fragments, the Black General created a network of invisible envoys stationed in royal courts and universities across Europe. Their mission was not to convert, but to guide, ensuring that knowledge, wealth, and influence always flowed back toward the Church's unseen center. Each envoy carried a cipher known as the Seal of 12, derived from the sigillum of the Shadow Pontiff. Those who bore it were bound to secrecy for life. The document suggested that the Black General may have survived long past his recorded era, his identity passed down from one generation to the next, a title rather than a man. You will never find his full name, Lucian said softly. Even the ink fears it. When I asked what became of the first black general, he replied, "He vanished after the Council of Trent. Some say he withdrew to the east. Others say he became something more than mortal, an idea preserved through obedience." The thought chilled me. I looked again at the half-erased name and realized the truth it implied. The Shadow Pontiff did not rule alone. He ruled through others, men who carried his will like a contagion, spreading it without ever revealing the source. Authority without visibility, power by proxy. The Black General was not a commander of soldiers. He was a commander of silence, and silence, in the hands of the Church, was the deadliest weapon of all. The chapel smelled of incense and varnish, a scent meant to calm the mind and stir the spirit. Father Lucien led me past rows of pews until we reached a small altar tucked in the corner, nearly invisible beneath a tangle of gilded vines and faded tapestries. On it rested what the faithful believed to be a saint's bone, a relic said to have been carried across Europe by the Shadow Pontiff himself. Pilgrims came to kneel before it, whispering prayers, placing coins and candles. The Codex had mentioned it, but in a way that suggested the story was a facade. Father Lucien produced a small metal box from his robe. Inside were the instruments of modern examination: lenses, magnets, and a chemical kit. He explained that the relic had been tested in secret laboratories during the late 20th century. The results were astonishing. The bone was not bone at all. It was a stylus, carved from bronze and sharpened to a point used by scholars of the 4th century for writing on wax tablets. The realization struck me like cold water. The Shadow Pontiff had taken an object of mundane utility and transformed it into a vessel of reverence. Awe, it seemed, was a tool. The faithful believed in miracles, but the miracle itself was an illusion. By sanctifying ordinary objects, the Church guided the mind away from questions. While people marveled at the relic, they forgot to ask about the origins of the texts, the knowledge that had been erased, or the scholars who had written them. It was a subtle form of control, a way to anesthetize memory. Father Lucien explained that this technique had been repeated across centuries. Objects, events, and even stories were repurposed to distract and sanctify forgetting. A manuscript that could reveal missing years was turned into a devotional reading. A device measuring the heavens was framed as an instrument of prophecy, and the relic before us was a masterstroke, a symbol of authority that required no sword or decree. I ran my hand over the stylus, feeling its smooth surface worn by centuries of use. It had been sharpened not for destruction but for knowledge, yet that knowledge had been hidden beneath a veil of faith. The Shadow Pontiff understood that human minds are easily guided when awe replaces curiosity. Belief is stronger than evidence, and reverence can make forgetting feel like devotion. I looked again at the altar, imagining generations of pilgrims kneeling, praying, and never realizing the truth. A simple bronze stylus had become a miracle, and through it, centuries of ideas had been preserved, altered, and buried. The power of the leader lay not in what was revealed, but in what the faithful never noticed. He had taught men to bow before the illusion, while reality, the dangerous truth, remained hidden in plain sight. The relic was not a relic at all. It was a tool, and in the hands of the Shadow Pontiff, tools became the instruments of memory and of forgetting alike. The papers arrived in thick envelopes, sealed with wax, and stamped with insignias I recognized from the Codex. Father Lucien laid them on the table, spreading letters from the 15th and 16th centuries, correspondence between kings, princes, and the Vatican. At first, they seemed like ordinary political letters, compliments on marriages, trades, and alliances. Then I noticed the pattern. Each letter contained subtle requests, phrases that implied not action but omission. One king promised to adjust his court chronicles in exchange for absolution from a minor transgression. Another offered to suppress a popular historian's findings to receive a papal indulgence. A third begged for guidance on war with a neighbouring state, and, in return, was instructed to revise the dates of certain public events in the royal annals. Father Lucian explained that these letters revealed a type of warfare that was silent yet brutal. The Shadow Pontiff did not need armies or cannons. He had paper, ink, and the authority of heaven itself. With a few lines, he could make kings rewrite history, alter laws, or erase inconvenient truths. It was a war fought not with soldiers, but with signatures. Each document carried leverage that combined spiritual authority and temporal influence. The king received the illusion of salvation, while the church received the power to shape reality. I picked up a letter from the year 1579. It was addressed to the Duke of Milan. The Pope promised forgiveness for past indiscretions and protection for future heirs if the Duke would ensure that the founding dates of several monasteries were corrected according to the new canonical calendar. By changing these dates, the Church controlled when certain events appeared to have happened, which in turn reinforced its claim of uninterrupted authority. It was brilliant and terrifying. Father Lucian traced the connections on a map. Lines linked popes to monarchs, to merchants, to universities, each line representing a deal made in silence. Trade absolutions for edits, indulgences for revisions, salvation for silence. I realized then that the Church's power was not merely spiritual, it was administrative, bureaucratic, and deeply personal. A ruler could not rise without permission, not because of armies, but because the Vatican held the ledger of their lives. By controlling what was recorded and what was forgotten, the Shadow Pontiff ensured that the world's memory aligned with his will. The letters were fragile, their edges brittle with age, yet the weight they carried was immense. They were evidence of a campaign that spanned centuries, a paper war fought with devotion, fear, and cunning. Every king who signed had unknowingly become a soldier in a war where the enemy was history itself. I left the room thinking about the ease with which power could be exercised without violence, only through ink and faith. The war was not fought in fields or castles. It was fought in the hearts and minds of men, and the Shadow Pontiff had been victorious for longer than anyone dared to imagine. The room smelled of old parchment and candle smoke, a quiet perfume of centuries. Father Matteo, the archivist, lay on a narrow cot, his breathing shallow, hands trembling as they clutched a stack of papers. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more than any living soul should. "You want the truth," he said in a whisper, barely audible over the ticking of a small clock on the wall. I nodded. He coughed, then continued. "Nothing is destroyed here. Not truly. We learned long ago that to burn knowledge is too crude. It stirs questions. It creates martyrs. No, the true method is delay. To hide a book, not by fire, but by time." He reached for a nearby slip of parchment, handing it to me. It bore the same seal I had seen on the codex, the cross within a circle surrounded by 12 dots. "See this?" he asked. "Every document, every manuscript, every record goes through the ritual of preservation. Not to be used, not to be seen, we store it, track it, protect it. And the world forgets." I asked him why the Church would go to such lengths. His lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "Because knowledge is power, and power must be metered. The world is not ready for the light all at once. The Shadow Pontiff knew this. He knew that to preserve order, you must teach obedience first, curiosity later, if ever. The chains of history are soft, like velvet. They bind without pain, but they bind forever." He wheezed, pausing to catch his breath. "You see, fire destroys, chains break. But velvet is patient. You carry it for a lifetime, never aware it is a chain. A generation passes, then another, each taught what is safe to know, each believing they are free. And the knowledge sleeps, waiting." His hand shook as he gestured toward the rows of shelves behind him, stacked with manuscripts that no eye outside the archives had seen in decades, some in languages long forgotten. Every lost century, every missing scholar, every erased map, none were gone. They were merely postponed. The world believes it forgot, but we remembered. We are the keepers of delay. I felt the weight of his confession pressing on me. It was not just the theft of information. It was the shaping of perception, the quiet moulding of generations. I asked him if anyone else knew the full scope. He shook his head. No. Only those who serve the shadow pontiff. Only those who understand that power need not shout. Silence is enough. And we have maintained it for centuries. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again with clarity. Remember, when you study history, what is missing is often more telling than what remains. The velvet chains do not break. They only hold tighter with time. And the world never realizes it is bound. I left the room with the papers clutched to my chest, the words of the dying archivist echoing in my mind. Nothing destroyed, everything delayed. Soft, ritual, eternal. In that silence, I understood the true nature of control and the patient hand that wielded it through centuries unseen. The chapel of rehearsals was hidden beneath the streets of Florence, its entrance disguised as a storage room behind the church of San Lorenzo. Father Lucien led me down a spiral staircase, carved from worn stone, the air growing cooler and thick with dust. At the bottom, the chamber opened into a vaulted hall lit by lanterns that cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. The floor was lined with rows of wooden tables covered in blueprints, sketches, and diagrams so precise they seemed to have been drawn yesterday rather than centuries ago. I knelt to examine one. It was a detailed plan of the Palazzo Vecchio, overlaid with notes on light angles, fresco placements, and the sequence of public unveilings. Father Lucien whispered that these were rehearsal plans, not architectural drafts. The Shadow Pontiff had ensured that Renaissance breakthroughs appeared in curated bursts, timed like ceremonies in a liturgy. Each invention, painting, or sculpture was not merely created. It was unveiled according to a schedule dictated by the Church, designed to distract, inspire, and control perception. The blueprints showed how the placement of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, Michelangelo's sculptures, and even the designs for Florence's water systems had been carefully staged to give the illusion of a spontaneous cultural explosion. Yet beneath the art, beneath the science, older works had been hidden, older knowledge buried in the shadow of the staged brilliance. I traced a line connecting several documents, each labelled with the same sigillum I had seen throughout my journey, the cross within a circle and 12 dots, the Shadow Pontiff's mark. Lucien explained that the timing of discoveries was critical. If a painting revealed too much or an invention too early, it could lead to questions about previous eras, questions the Church was not yet ready to answer. The Renaissance was not a sudden awakening. It was a performance, rehearsed and controlled. As I examined another set of plans, I saw notes indicating public ceremonies where scientists would present mechanical models, astronomers would demonstrate celestial observations, and scholars would introduce translations of ancient texts. Each event was carefully sequenced to give the impression of innovation, while older knowledge remained invisible. The chamber itself seemed to hum with the echoes of whispered rehearsals, monks and scholars preparing their roles centuries ago. It was a stage beneath a city, a theatre where the audience believed they were witnessing the birth of genius, not the careful unveiling of what had always existed. I stepped back and felt the weight of centuries pressing down. The masterpieces of the Renaissance, celebrated as sparks of human creativity, had been choreographed. Each flourish, each discovery, had been allowed to shine only when the world was ready to see it. The truth of prior knowledge, the works that had been hidden, remained sealed in silence, waiting for a time dictated not by invention, but by control. In that chamber, beneath the hum of Florence above, I realized the Renaissance was less a rebirth and more a carefully staged performance, a sequence of brilliance designed to deflect questions about the shadows that had come before. The map lay beneath layers of charts from the 16th century, tucked inside a portfolio bound with worn leather. Its edges were frayed, the paper yellowed with age, but the lines drawn across it were impossibly precise. Father Lucien lifted the cover with reverence, revealing coastlines that did not exist in any atlas of the period. I traced the curves of bays and rivers with my finger, recognizing landforms that had not been charted until centuries later. This was not prophecy, this was planning. The Shadow Pontiff, it seemed, had drafted futures and then backdated the past to match. Each curve, each peninsula, each island had been drawn with meticulous care, overlaid on older maps to appear as though it had always been there. Notes in the margins indicated sources, voyages, and measurements, some attributed to explorers who had never lived. Others referenced instruments that would not exist for another 100 years. Father Lucien explained that the Vatican had maintained a network of surveyors, scholars, and envoys, whose task was not merely to observe the world, but to shape it on paper first. Every map that would later be published in Venice, Lisbon, or Paris was first filtered through this hidden office, altered to reflect the vision of the Shadow Pontiff. It was as if history itself were a canvas, painted in reverse. I noticed a small symbol in the corner, the familiar cross within a circle, and 12 dots stamped in dark ink. The sigillum was not a signature, it was a claim of authorship over time itself. According to Lucien, these maps served a dual purpose. They provided guidance for the Church's agents, ensuring that trade, exploration, and conquest followed routes beneficial to its power, and they concealed knowledge from those who might act too early, disrupting the carefully orchestrated sequence of events. I realized that the Shadow Pontiff's office had become a temporal workshop. The past and the future were not separate. They were intertwined, adjusted, and aligned so that the present unfolded according to plan. One of the charts depicted the west coast of South America in astonishing detail, centuries before official explorers had ever arrived. Another showed a network of waterways in the Mediterranean altered to redirect trade. Every feature was deliberate, a mechanism of influence disguised as geography. As I stared at the map, I understood the enormity of the deception. It was not mere secrecy or control of information, it was the construction of reality itself. By drafting the future and then retrofitting the past, the Shadow Pontiff ensured that the world believed it was discovering, when in truth it was following a preordained path. I rolled the map carefully, aware that each line represented not just land but power. This was the ultimate exercise of authority, the ability to shape what people believed had always existed and what they would one day accept as inevitable. The office had crafted the map of tomorrow long before the first voyage set sail, and centuries later, the world sailed exactly where it had been led to go. The chamber was small, lit by a single oil lamp that cast trembling shadows across the stone walls. Father Lucien guided me to the centre, where a figure sat behind a heavy oak desk, his posture calm and deliberate. He did not rise, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, measured me like a scholar weighing evidence. "I have been expecting you," he said in a voice that carried centuries of authority without arrogance. This was the custodian, the current holder of the Shadow Pontiff's mandate. The title had changed, he explained, over generations, as the Church evolved, but the responsibility remained the same. Power, he said, is not a crown to wear, but a relay to pass. Each custodian receives what the last preserved, guarding it, shaping it, and then transferring it to the next with care. I asked what it meant to hold such authority. He leaned back, hands steepled, eyes glinting in the flickering light. "It means understanding that visibility is weakness. To rule openly is to invite resistance. The work is done in silence, in preparation, in patience. The world believes in kings, generals, and popes, but true influence moves unseen. He gestured toward a small cabinet filled with maps, manuscripts, and charts, some of which I recognized from my journey through the vaults. Every document here represents decisions that affect centuries, actions that shape what people believe happened and what they will believe tomorrow. The mandate is to ensure continuity, not glory. I thought of the Black General, the Shadow Pontiff, and the Orrery. All of it pointed to the same lesson. Power is less about authority and more about control of memory and time. The custodian continued, telling me that his predecessors had learned the same. They did not act in isolation, nor did they wield the force of armies. Their task was to monitor, to adjust, to allow revelations only when the world could absorb them safely. The position is a relay, not a reign. Each successor inherits what must be protected and what must remain invisible. I asked if this was a burden. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. It is a responsibility, yes, but it is also a privilege. To hold the relay is to preserve the architecture of knowledge, the invisible skeleton upon which civilization moves. Few understand the work, and fewer still know it exists. That is how it must be. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of a small clock, the sound of time itself being measured, preserved, and managed. I realized then that the custodian did not rule in the conventional sense. He was a steward of influence, a guardian of secrets, a keeper of history's rhythm. The mandate would outlast any individual, just as the Shadow Pontiff had intended. And as I left the chamber, I felt the weight of that legacy pressing on me. Power is not to be seen. Power is to be maintained, passed carefully, and protected in shadows. The world may never know, yet it bends to the guidance of hands that remain unseen. I held the codex carefully, its leather cover cool and smooth beneath my fingers. The final page was blank, empty, as if the author had forgotten to write the conclusion. I ran my hand over the parchment, feeling its texture, imagining the centuries of hands that had touched it before mine. Father Lucien leaned close, his breath warm in the dim light. "Some pages do not reveal themselves until they are ready," he whispered. I struck a match and held a small candle above the page. The flame flickered, casting a dancing glow across the blank surface. Slowly, faint letters began to appear, rising from the paper as if summoned by the heat. The instruction was simple, yet powerful. Publish nothing, teach memory. I felt a chill run through me. For centuries, every lesson I had learned about the Shadow Pontiff, the Black General, the maps, the vaults, and the orrery had been about control. And now, the codex revealed the ultimate purpose. It was not for the world to read, not for scholars to publish, and not for the curious to debate. It was to be remembered. Knowledge had always been preserved in silence, curated and measured. The leaders had understood that the act of teaching memory, of passing understanding through careful guidance, was more potent than any book, any decree, or any map. Father Lucien explained that to teach memory was to cultivate awareness without exposing all truths at once. It was a way to prepare minds for revelations that might otherwise be too dangerous or destabilizing. Every hidden archive, every staged renaissance, every delayed discovery served this purpose. The codex was the final lesson. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling the embossed impression of ink that only revealed itself in warmth. Publish nothing. Teach memory. The words seemed to vibrate with intention. I thought of the priests who had copied ancient manuscripts, of the cantores obscuri whose chants carried codes, of Canon Bellardi and his orrery, and the Black General who ruled through silence. Every act had been part of a larger design, a system of guidance rather than domination. I closed the codex gently, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on my chest. To remember is to preserve. To teach memory is to maintain the flow of truth without releasing it recklessly. The codex instructed not to reveal, but to pass wisdom carefully, to imprint knowledge in those who could carry it forward without endangering the delicate balance. Outside, the candle flame flickered and settled, its light steady like the guidance it represented. I realized then that the true power of the Shadow Pontiff and his successors lay not in the secrets themselves, but in the way they ensured that memory endured. The page was blank again as the candle cooled, as if nothing had ever appeared. Yet I knew what I had seen. The lesson was clear: publish nothing, teach memory. And with that, the Codex had completed its final command, leaving the future in careful, deliberate hands. The candlelight flickered across the table, illuminating the map, the orrery, and the dictamen. Each item seemed to pulse with centuries of silent authority, the weight of knowledge too heavy for any one person to carry alone. I had spent months tracing their paths, uncovering the methods of the Shadow Pontiff, the strategies of the Black General, and the deliberate orchestration of history itself. And now I faced a choice: keep the light boxed, as the Codex commanded, or let it spill into the world. I touched the map first, its modern coastlines and hidden routes, a testament to control over both geography and time. I traced the curves with my finger, imagining the futures that had been drafted and backdated. To release this map was to challenge everything people believed about discovery, about progress, and about the very shape of the world. The orrery stood like a silent witness, its brass planets frozen in motion, each rotation a reminder that the timing of revelation had always been deliberate. To show it was to reveal that history itself had been measured and curated. And the dictamen, folded and worn, carried instructions older than the Renaissance. Frame time: educate through omission, illuminate selectively. The doctrine was simple, yet profound. It was power made visible only to those who knew how to read it. I remembered the words of Father Matteo, the dying archivist: "Nothing is destroyed, only delayed." I remembered the choir whose songs hid coordinates to a vault. I remembered the ledger, where living documents were recorded, and the trials where ideas were condemned instead of men. Each act of revelation, each careful preservation, had been meant to shape humanity without its consent. Now the choice was mine. To remain silent would be to honor centuries of meticulous control. To publish, to teach, to share memory openly would be to rupture that carefully constructed order. I knew the price. Peace would be lost. Authority would tremble. People would question truths they had long assumed immutable. Yet, despite the risk, I could not remain a custodian of secrets any longer. I gathered the items carefully, wrapping the dictamen and rolling the map. The orrery, fragile and alive with brass and intention, would have to be photographed and catalogued. Every step I took was measured, aware that the act of transmission itself was dangerous. Outside, the night was still, quiet, as if the world waited for the first ripple of change. I sent copies of the map to scholars, shared the framework of the orrery with historians, and distributed the essence of the dictamen to those capable of understanding it without panic. The first price of truth is indeed the loss of peace. Letters arrived within weeks, questions flooded, theories emerged, some accused, some celebrated, but the silence that had been imposed for centuries had finally been broken. I stood in the flickering candlelight, knowing that the light once kept in a box was now circulating among those willing to see, to remember, to teach. The Shadow Pontiff's designs had survived time, but the relay of power had shifted. Control was no longer absolute, and for the first time in centuries, history could breathe freely, guided by memory rather than manipulation, illuminated not by secrecy, but by the courage to reveal.